Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Poema podcast. I am James Prescott, your host. Welcome to the show. It's really great to have you all back again with us, and I'm honoured to have a new guest on the show today. Somebody I've got to know in the last year or so on social media, and he's a Times columnist and also an author, and he's just released a new book, which we're going to talk about today. So welcome to the show, Daniel Finklestein.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah,
Really fun.
it's great to have you here, and we're gonna talk about your book. It's quite a long title, actually. I'm trying to remember just try to get it right. It's what's it called? Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad: A Family Memoir of Miraculous Survival. And the title's quite self-explanatory, really, actually. But
Yes. Well, when it
it's a,
takes quite a long time to decide upon the title. It was one of those troublesome features of it, and I came up with the title. It's not a competition, which reflected my mother's view about Hitler and Stalin when she was asked who was worse. And then I had Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad as the subtitle. And I went to lunch with my agent, told him how I was progressing with the book, told him my idea for a title, and he went, "Oh, no, the subtitle's definitely the title." And he was right, I think, because although it is a bit of a mouthful, as you as shown, it does summarize the book, and that is really important. If you look at books, when I began to look at book titles, I realized an awful lot of the time people have come up with these incredibly clever ways of encapsulating the whole book, and I wanted to do something that was as good as that. So we did work on it very hard, but I think we should come up with a good title.
yes, absolutely, and it's a very, very powerful book. I've been working my way through it this week. It's not a book that you can just kind of pick up and just read all the way through. Like, there's a lot of, because of the content of it. There's a lot of times you just need to sit down and and just pause and take it in. Um, and so just tell
Would
us
it
what the book's about.
Yeah, would it help if I did that? Yeah. So, my, I was brought up in Hendon Central, around the corner from Brent Cross Shopping Centre. In many ways, a completely ordinary, middle class, but because my father was a professor, my mother was a teacher, life. My grandmother lived around the corner. Didn't have any other grandparents alive anymore, and we're Jewish, but we're not. We're Reform religious, so we're not Orthodox. And I felt perfectly at home with the other children my age who also lived in this country. As you know, James, I became a passionate Chelsea fan, had all the normal teenage
Absolutely.
hobbies of Hendon boys. And as I grew older, I began to appreciate that my background was anything other than normal. My grandfather, Alfred Wiener, my mother's father, had been the leader of Germany's Jews in the 1920s and 30s. He'd taken the position from 1919. In other words, something like 10, perhaps 20 years before anyone else, that that the rise of Nazism, or as it was when he first started, anti-Semitic ideas in Germany was profoundly dangerous, not just to Germany's Jews, but to the country in general. He'd begun to campaign all over the country. He'd spoken in big meetings that were broken up by Nazis. He'd been he'd been the editor of the community newspaper. He'd sued key Nazi figures in court. And he'd collected together from the late 1920s all sorts of material about the Nazis. So just throwing forward to many years later, when people wanted to know what who Joseph Mengele, the so-called Doctor of Death of Auschwitz, whether he was or was not in Argentina, my grandfather was the only person who had a photo of Mengele because he'd been collecting all this material. In 1933, he is confronted personally by Hermann Goering, who calls him to a meeting. The meeting's at first perfectly innocent, although Goering's trying to tell him that, as the Jewish community, as long as it's not rebellious, he'll be all right. And at the end of this meeting, he says, "I know you've got the archive, and you have to destroy it." And my grandfather realizes quite soon, as a result of this and a subsequent meeting that Goering has with the Jewish community, that he has to leave Germany. And he goes to Holland, and that's where my mother comes in, because she was born in 1933 in Berlin, but as a baby in arms goes to live in Holland. And the thing about that there's a Dutch Jewish community, but they're now joined by German Jews, and one of the other German Jews better obviously known than my family was Anne and Margot Frank. Otto Frank and his wife Edith moved to the same area. They are in the same synagogues, in the same schools, so they have a very similar experience behind them. In 1939, because the Dutch are worried it was breaking their neutrality, my grandfather has to take the library, the archive, to London, but they think Holland will remain neutral. So they don't he doesn't go with his wife and children, and my mother is trapped in Holland. And the rest of the book is the story, of what happens then. And my mother is first in Westerbork, from which lots of people go to the gas chambers. She does not, because she has a passport which is obtained from Paraguay, and the book tells how that happens and how she ends up having an exchange trip. So that is my mother, who comes to this country in 1947 with that behind her. And obviously the book tells you lots I haven't told you, a lot of twists and turns in that story, a lot of surprises. And I've tried it's not a political polemic. This is a story. It's a family story. I put it in historical context so you can understand what's happening and why it's happening, but I try not to make it into a political lecture. It's supposed to be, and the reviews have suggested that it is, pacey and readable. Then on the other side of the family, my father my mother's, if you like, has got a kind of very unusual version of a story maybe familiar to your listeners, which is she was in a concentration camp and involved in the Holocaust. My father was involved in a much more bog standard version of an atrocity that most people are not aware of, which was the attempt by Stalin to wipe out the whole of the Polish middle class and elite. And he tries to do this by invading Poland when the Germans invade the other half of Russia. Poland, they've got a pact. The Russians invade, take control of Lviv, or Lvov as it was when my father was born there, but you all know it as Lviv. And my grandfather was arrested and he's sent to the Gulag. When my grandfather goes to the Gulag, he imagines that my grandmother imagines she's going to be told where he is, instead of which they arrest the rest of the family and send them to Siberia. So the book follows them there and follows them out.
Yeah, and it's very, very. You put it very well. I mean, it is definitely a story. There's no kind of, as you say, that you definitely succeed in it being a story of your family rather than anything else. And I think because knowing the history, and then when you humanize something and you put flesh and blood on it, and it's a real it's a human story, suddenly it takes on a whole different kind of depth. One of the parts of the bit which really made me kind of stop and pause is when you just, and this is really powerful in the audiobook, especially when you're listing the numbers, a list of people and their name and their number,
So
who
in one of the
happened to them.
You're
Yeah.
quite right. In one of the chapters, which is called Joy and Glee, I wrote, and this was based on a document I stumbled across in my aunt's papers, my mother's older sister. My mother's older sister had kept records of a kind of children's club, a kind of sweet little thing that they formed. These are kids that are 12 to 9 years old, some of them 7 years old even, and they have little competitions with the kids on the street. They organise little outings, and they have a newsletter where people write poems and things like that. And she kept some examples of the newsletter and a whole list of members. And so what I thought I would do is go through each of these members and see whether I could trace what happened to them. And I succeeded with all but one person, I think, in working out, it was 20 of them, in working out what happened to them. and each of them ends up in some form, except for the one person that wasn't Jewish. But all the Jewish people in it end up with in some form of captivity, and most of them either are killed or come close to being killed. And I tell that story, but at the end, I said, despite the fact that there are a lot of these children in this club died, the average number that survived in that group was much higher than in the street they lived in. And I got hold of the records for Jan van Ekstraat, the street where my mother lived, and I just went through house by house. And it turned out that in almost every house, I mean, it would be quicker to define the houses where this did not happen, somebody was killed in the gas chambers or starved to death.
Yeah, and and hearing you read out the names and what happened to them, I had to pause it at that point just to kind of take it in, because it, again, like, even if you know the history of the Second World War and you know the history of the Holocaust, it's still, when you put names to it, when you put faces to it, when you put flesh and blood on it, it adds a different dimension to it. And certainly it kind of brings it home, the kind of gravity of what happened.
So it's interesting you felt that, Jez, because one of the things that I had to balance in this book, I want to make sure that people are not put off from reading it by the fact that they feel that everybody in it and everything in it are doomed. And, the truth is my parents had a very happy life, and they brought up 3 children who also are having a happy life. This book has a happy ending and actually has a happy beginning too. But I also had to make sure that you're not underplaying, the sheer horror of the things that happened to the people in it. So I did have to tell that story too, and I hope I get the right balance. You need to do both.
Yes, absolutely, and that's really important, because there is a happy ending to the story, and that's very hopeful, and that's very positive. So yeah, it's worth reading to the end, that's for sure. So yes, I mean that's really important to remember, because it is a story about hope as well. That, I mean, like, reading about your parents and your grandparents as well. They're remarkable people. They really are. I mean, I was like Alfred, especially, was with what you talk about him kind of raising the possibility of what could have happened so early on when nobody was really listening, and continuing to kind of advocate for that for so many years, and then kind of it not really getting through, and then ultimately it happens.
It's extraordinary, and that
Yeah.
I think that you know, uh, in addition to the kind of the stories of what happened in the concentration camp, my grandfather's life is pretty extraordinary.
Yes, it is. I mean, he did some incredible things, really. Yeah, it's an amazing heritage to come from, as well.
Yeah,
I mean, as it. I mean, as someone who's written books as well, like, I know that when you write a book, it's often has an impact on you. I mean, how did writing this book about your family and everything they went through, and having to kind of delve into that a lot more deeply, how did that impact you?
well, actually, some people have asked me this question. I think assuming that it would have been quite traumatic, and there were moments like that. What happens to my great aunt and my great uncle and my mother's first cousin? That was, when I understood it properly, that was quite disturbing. Learning what had happened to my father's aunts and uncles, that was also quite disturbing. However, um, some of it was really pleasant. I got connected to people in the family, some of whom, I was only just about aware that they existed. And, I had to go through 90 letters written by my grandmother's siblings. And these were not figures that I was that aware of. And that was wonderful. I sort of felt as though I gained all these new relatives, and I got to, I knew my grandmother Lucia, my father's mother, but the other grandparents I didn't. So, and Alfred is a renowned character, the one that set up the archive, and so I'd read quite a lot about him, but I felt I got to know the other grandparents in a way that I hadn't before. That was
Yeah,
nice.
yeah, that's wonderful. Um, yeah, I mean that's one of the benefits, I guess, isn't it? Of when you write things about your family, like I mean, I've written memoirs and things before, um, and when you talk to, and I've talked to my parents about their background, and got to know my family a bit, and it's yeah, it can be a really good thing, and obviously they're inspirational people as well.
Yeah,
So
so I do. That's true. So I was saying this to my sister yesterday that so part of the story that at the core of the story are two very strong women, my grandmothers. And my grandmother Lusher, I did know, knew her as Granny, and she and I always knew that she kind of had a toughness about her. I remember that we'd be in her house and somebody would phone up, and she would talk, and if she felt they were being boring, she'd put the phone down on the bed and carry on. Uh, to make herself a cup of coffee, not ignoring completely who was on the phone. I knew there was a sort of element of her that was kind of quite uh, didn't care what people thought about her, and I kind of understood that a lot better when I read this story. So I've always taken an inspiration, but the courage of Greta, my mother's mother, seeing them through the concentration camps, and that was pretty striking. And there's an amazing letter in the book that she writes to my aunt on her 17th birthday, on her 16th birthday. I'm sorry. Very moving to read that.
yes, absolutely, absolutely, and I've seen as well you've posted on your Twitter account as well a video of you holding the star that they had to wear on their clothing. And I think didn't they have to pay for it in the first place, and then they had to wear it, and of
Yeah,
course it
yeah,
was added to kind of the prejudice that they experienced.
absolutely, yeah.
So
So
that's
So yeah, they left behind, in the room I'm sitting there. There are still some of those things, lots of artifacts, which include the passport. I can, I can see that from where I'm sitting now. The passport they used, the yellow star that they had in the days before the camps. Quite a striking thing to have, yeah, and to be connected with your history in that way is a privilege.
absolutely, yes, it is. I mean,
Do you
like
want to just
how did?
pause? I want to just pause for 1 second?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Just a little pause there, everyone listeners. But yeah, I mean, like this whole kind of how did it impact your parents to have to, sorry, your grandparents to have to guide, obviously, to have to help your parents respectively to survive and somehow not be too affected by what was going on around them because obviously your parents were children, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think they were
Experience.
strong people, and I think they were, you know, I, I think, which I did get it. They were highly intellectual people, which in my and my grandmother was kind of quite a grand society figure, and they all had their peculiarities, but fortunately, they were kind of at their core quite resilient people, I think, and they were determined, both my grandparents, to see their children through what was happening to them. They were both separated in their imprisonment from their husbands, so they had the sole care of it. The children, and for years my grandmother had nobody else who could look after my father at all. Whereas, and that was whereas at least my grandmother had a 16-year-old daughter, so that was a little bit of assistance.
Hmm. Yeah, and of course to be actually experiencing that yourself and then having to protect your children, um, and somehow not give the impression to them that you're scared or affected by it, and to try and normalize life for them as much as possible and that's a big weight to carry.
It is, yes. So, and you're picking up on an important point. So, one of the things I try to emphasize, we all know that one of the things that happens, to the refugees in the Second World War is the killing and the starvation, and but
Yeah,
I try to also bring out the fact that they were also inconvenienced by a lot of much more banal difficulties. My grandmother, or my mother's mother, has no money. My grandfather has all the money and he's in London. She can't get any of it. She finds it extremely difficult to scrape together any income to live on. Um, they've lost their citizenship, and that, which later turns into a calamity, is at first quite a big nuisance. My grandfather at that point could come to Holland, but he hasn't got the documentation, and my grandmother's worried that he has got cotton socks and that he wouldn't be able to. She feels responsible for the fact that she can't get his clothes to him. And lots of these things have got to do with their quite banal problems. She runs out of money. My grandfather on the other side, they do the same thing. So one of the things about the refugee life that it reveals, and one of the things about the oppressive regimes that it reveals, is that they do much more than simply kill people. They also make life really, really difficult in lots and lots of very small ways. During the period in which the Jews were in Holland rather than in Amsterdam rather than taken to Westerbork camp. My aunt and my mum can't play tennis. They can't go to the park. They cannot go to the cinema. They can't go swimming. They can't go on their bikes because bikes were confiscated. Almost every thing that a child or even an adult might want to do for recreation, they're not able to do. And those I try to bring out that kind of the impact of those kind of rather more banal difficulties.
yeah, and definitely that comes across. That and especially like towards the beginning, before kind of the concentration camps, it was a lot of those little things that just got taken away. Those little freedoms and little restrictions and awkward things that like they couldn't do that everyone else could do. That that's how those things begin, isn't it? It's always with
Absolutely.
those little things to start with, and then it kind of you know becomes obviously more serious over time.
Completely, and that's vital. I mean, that seems to be an interesting thing to bring out. So, what I'm trying to do here is to tell the story of these big ideological forces through the granular life of my parents. One of the things that I had, which lots of people whose parents or grandparents were involved in the Holocaust or in the Gulag, is that they didn't have much in the way of documentation or witness statements, and I had a lot, and that's why I was able to write the book that I've written. It's got a lot of detail in it. My mum kept the coupon for the dining car of the cruise ship that took them from the concentration camp to the United States. My grandmother on my father's side kept 90 letters that were sent to them in Siberia. And something like 60,000 words of correspondence between Finkelsteins and Diamensteins in the war period. So you can imagine how useful that is to somebody trying to get into the granularity of what happens to them.
Yes, because that's when you really see the genuine human impact of these big decisions and these two oppressive regimes. And there's no doubt that they, both the Nazi regime and Stalin's regime were, very dictatorial and oppressive. And Stalin kind of was officially on the side of the Allies, but he wasn't. He was by no means virtuous, and nor was his regime. It's And then you talked about Poland as well. That's the other thing. I've done a lot of history, and the Polish tragedy, of kind of being stuck between Nazi Germany and obviously Stalin's Russia, and how that impacted that nation for such a long time afterwards as well, like after the war.
So one of the things
Um,
I tried to do in the book is to put everything in the historical context so that people who are reading the book can understand for themselves terms that they may have heard. And so the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which possibly people have come across but may not know very much about, that is covered never in a lot of theoretical detail, but the implications for individuals is covered, and you always understand where it comes from.
Mm.
I read a lot of Holocaust accounts where people separate their own experience from the historical context, and I wanted to put both in the book.
Yeah, I think that's important because it paints a much bigger picture because understanding one helps you understand the other because it's when you separate. I think when you separate, I'm not saying that it's wrong to separate them for some people, some authors to do that, but I think for me, like reading the story in the book with the historical kind of context around it made it much more authentic and
Thank you.
much more human, I guess, because you're seeing the real life consequences of political decisions and the kind of day to day stuff, like you're talking about the mundane stuff that you talked about, the small things, and obviously it led to those led to the big things like being taken to concentration camps, but just those all those consequences of these big decisions that were going on around them. It's just that we're trying to, and then you have these two families trying to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah,
Um,
absolutely. So that's the core of it, and I hope it's also but it's very important to I do have a sort of purpose of it. The purpose of writing this book is to tell the story of people who end up very happily married to each other, living in a suburb of London. And my parents do miss their teenage years completely. My father, when I used to ask my father, James, who he supported in football, he used to say he supported a team called Pippidufka United.
oh yes, I remember
It
this
turns
book.
out to be completely fake team, and I took it seriously. And he wasn't interested in any of those things, and maybe he wouldn't have been anyway, because him and my maternal grandfather was sort of all their heads were always in kind of quite arcane books. But it is quite striking that they have this happy life. It's rather different from mine, but it still comes into contact with lots of things later in their life, like football, which earlier in their life they never had.
Yeah, and I think when you've been through some major trauma of any kind, I think if you survive that and you come out of that and you are able to build a life, I guess there's more of a sense of gratitude for the life you have because of what you've been through.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's what we are trying to. That's what I try to. That's what I try to convey. Um, and I think I think people will read it and they'll come out knowing much more about terms that they've heard. Even for myself, James, I found that even though my mother had been in Belsen, I didn't really understand why, what that was. She said to me it was a sort of different camp, and they had the chance to go there. I didn't really understand what she meant by that, and I understood it much better now. And I understood that in some ways, in Holocaust terms, being able to go to Belsen rather than to Auschwitz or Sobibor was actually a result, which is extraordinary considering how appalling the life was when you actually got there. So they set off on this train with all sorts of reassurances about the place they're going to, and it turns out to be appalling.
Yeah, I think that's how it was kind of dressed up at the time, wasn't it? You talk about this in the book how the language that the Germans used for sending Jews to concentration camps so that they could absolve themselves of responsibility in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's exactly what it is. So the other thing I was trying to bring out is that we all know the crimes of the Nazis because it comes out at the end of the war. The Nazis lose the war. All of their main figures are convicted at the Nuremberg trials. And the first document sitting in this office where I am now, that I pulled out, the first file I opened was quite a striking thing. My grandfather had a personal copy of the indictment of the Nuremberg defendants, and an original copy of that. And I was completely struck by it, obviously, as you would be. And I went through this document, and I realised that everything that the Nazi criminals were accused of doing was something the Soviets had done too. Remember that the Eichmann trial, which comes later in after the war, that was focused mainly on the gas chambers and the Holocaust. And some of those things that the Russians did not do, but the things that the defendants were tried for at Nuremberg, yeah, they did those things 100%.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
one of the points of the book is to point out they never learned the lesson from that, and that's one of the reasons we're in the situation we are now.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yes, I couldn't help when I was reading it, but think of, today and how the world is, and some of the the rise of the hard right in different parts of the world, and that we kind of seem to never learn lessons from history.
I
Could
guess
be
I'm quite standard in sort of middle class circles in my fear of the far right. What I guess marks me out and has occasionally been a bit uncomfortable is I have a similar, it's not quite the same, but a similar fear about the hard left, which is considered a bit eccentric. But if you read the book, you'll see why I have that fear as well as the fear of the Nazis.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, yes, yes, the kind of, well, yeah, I mean, when you look at kind of the anti-Semitism issue that came up in the Labour Party in the last few years under the under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, that's definitely a valid concern. I mean,
Absolutely.
you
Look,
can't
it's
you can't
very
dismiss that.
important just to say that I always joke that Jeremy Corbyn was not a Stalinist because him and the Stalinists were at different ends of the ice pick. But that having been said, it explains why I have a problem with revolutionary movements. But the key thing I want to emphasize about the book is you don't need to start with any particular political position. My political position will not be that of every reader, I'm sure. This is just a story of what happened. People can draw their own political conclusions from that. They're welcome to They're welcome to find those differ sharply from mine. I've always been one of those people who doesn't want to, who understands my way of looking at issues isn't the same way as everyone will look at them or ought to look at them. I just hope you will come away absorbed and moved and knowing more. So thank you very much for
I,
giving me the chance to talk about it.
well, yeah, I mean, I didn't get any kind of political bias from the book at all. I didn't read that at all in the book. I mean, it is, as you say, a story that's set in a historical context, and then, like all stories, true stories especially, when you encounter them, they do something to you, and obviously they have a different impact on different people.
Absolutely.
And all those are valid because it's such a powerful story, and it's such a emotive story, and it's a story that's sadly relevant for our times as well. Um, but it's something that it's a story that needs to be told, and people need to read. I would encourage everyone to read this book because we need to be reminded that these things happened, because sometimes it can be easy to forget.
Well, thank you very much. So thank you very much indeed for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it. I hope that you found it interesting. I certainly really enjoyed being on it, and I hope that people will feel they want to read with Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, and learn some more about this story. But if they don't, then I hope that your and my discussion will give them some idea of what happened.
Yeah, absolutely, and I would recommend it to everyone. It is a very powerful book, and it needs to be read, I think. And so, thank you for coming on. It's been great to have you, and
Well,
everyone. I would recommend that book, and just it's available now. So, thanks for listening, everybody.